Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of HRE Insights in 30, where we spotlight the experts, innovations, and ideas shaping risk and compliance today. I'm your host, Justin Muscolino, and CEO of High Risk Education, and I couldn't think of a better way to kick things off than with a guest who is recognized globally for advancing financial crime training. Joining me today is Kim Manchester, Managing Director of Manchester CF, a company very well known for delivering world-class online financial intelligence training programs. Now, Kim is here today to discuss an issue that is becoming increasingly urgent for financial institutions in 2025, and that is proliferation financing. He'll also be giving us an exclusive look at the major update to Manchester CF's FIU Connect module on proliferation financing, which is set to be released towards the end of September. Kim, thanks for being here. We are thrilled to have you.
Thank you, Justin. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I've known you for many years, and I'm always glad to participate in whatever you want to do. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, Kim. So let's start out with some basic questions, and then we're going to build up to the proliferation financing training module.
Sure.
All right. So again, let's start with the basics and let's discuss, what exactly is proliferation financing and how is it different from, the other financial crime risks institutions are more familiar with, like money laundering or, terrorist financing.
So proliferation financing is fairly recent as a term. It involves chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons, and the financing networks that create these weapon systems or trade in these weapon systems or sell these weapon systems. Chemical weapons, I mean, we're going back to the First World War, but more recently, Bashar al-Assad, the former leader of Syria, used to use chemical weapons against his own people. Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons against the Kurds. Terrorists used chemical weapons. Shinrikyo in Tokyo used sarin gas. So there's still, I mean, I grew up thinking chemical weapons were something I saw in the First World War, the horrors of trench warfare with chlorine gas, etc. But it's 2025 and this is still a concern. Biological weapons are weapons. I mean, imagine if you weaponize pandemic. Imagine if COVID-19 was a weapon system developed to kill other people. Radiological, well, take an X-ray machine filled with radioactive isotopes, put some plastic explosive on the side of it, blow it up, and then you spread radiological debris over a defined area that forces cleanup, but may be so polluted with radioactive substances that it could become fenced off, much like Chernobyl in the Ukraine. And nuclear weapons, well, no explanation needed there. If you want to find out how scary nuclear weapons are, well, just read about Iran, North Korea, and other jurisdictions that are trying to get their hands on nuclear weapon systems. I have to go back to a hearing in the United States Senate where some of the engineers from one of the major research laboratories in the United States were talking to the senators and describing the concerns of nuclear weapons proliferation. And one of the physicists quipped that, you can essentially cobble one together from pretty rudimentary elements. And the senator looked at him and went, "Sorry, what? I need to know more about this, but I think we'll do this behind closed doors." So it's it's a really big concern. In 2025, the world is a bit of a scary place right now, and the threat of weapons of mass destruction is definitely there. And these weapon systems need to be created. They need components from around the world in some cases, and they involve middlemen, traders, exporting companies, importing companies, logistics firms, and financial institutions that facilitate both the trade, whether it be traditional trade finance. Usually it's not really in a supply chain finance environment, or open account trade with the associated payments. And then you have the individuals involved. Some of them are politically exposed persons. Some of them are convicted felons. Others are straw men that are there because they have a clean name and a clean record. You get into various elements of money laundering and terrorist financing, but it is, in my opinion, a separate category from money laundering, terrorist financing, sanctions, and corruption, because it has the unique element of we can't get it wrong.
Mm.
Like we can't just say, well, I mean, so long as we intercept 95% of WMDs, I'm sure we'll be fine. We really have to strive for 100. And that puts this risk into a different lens.
Yeah, and I think on top of all of that, what really is bothering me today is that, we're living in a pretty crazy world. And I think we can agree on that. So like, why do you think proliferation financing is becoming such a real critical issue for financial institutions right now? And, what's changed in the last year or two that makes this even more urgent than it has before?
I think the urgency is related to the various nation states that are, in some cases, in a state of war. There are several countries that have clashed militarily in the past 12 months. Both those countries are armed with nuclear weapons. And in one instance, that's Israel versus Iran. Iran, I'm suggesting they have nuclear weapons. I think they've been working very hard to try and achieve that. And I think it would be foolish to think that they don't have some sort of nuclear weapon capability, at least from a radiological weapon system
Mm,
standpoint. And then India and Pakistan. And they've had border clashes. They've very recently been shelling each other and sending missiles at each other. And that's terrifying. I
yeah.
mean, at what point do you hit escalation into nuclear weapons? If you go back in history, back to the mid 80s, NATO used to run exercises in examining the issue of military confrontation between NATO and what was then the Soviet Union. And in those wargaming exercises, in a book published by or written by a gentleman named Gwynne Dyer, the book is called War. It's a history of warfare. And he noted that in those exercises, NATO forces during these war games would reach a point, usually between 5 days to 1 week, after the first shots were fired with the Soviet Union, where nuclear weapons would be brought in. And so a conventional war wouldn't last very long before you ended up with what were called tactical nuclear weapons, which could be fired from artillery or dropped by an aircraft, or then go into ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. So what that suggests is that when two countries fight and they're both armed with nuclear weapons, things can escalate at a frightening pace.
Mm,
And from there, someone presses a trigger, and then it's game on.
yeah.
And we only need to look at Nagasaki, Hiroshima, as examples. And don't forget the nuclear weapons of today make those horrific explosions pale by comparison. And that's something to consider. The other fact is that we have Al Qaeda and ISIS being incredibly active in Africa.
Hmm.
We have um, Iran fighting through its proxies against the United States, against Israel. Uh, we have Russia and Ukraine. There's long been a general consensus that at some point in time, the Russians may contemplate using a tactical nuclear weapon to wipe out a Ukrainian city
Mm.
to impress upon the Ukrainians that maybe they should just back down. But the consequences of that would be pretty dire. So it's, 2025, and we're having these conversations. 1945 was the last time nuclear weapons were detonated. That was quite a while ago.
Yeah.
And we're still dealing with a very realistic possibility of seeing a mushroom cloud in the distance and having to endure the consequences. And I think that's morally bankrupt. And then when you look at governments uh, in G20 countries, um, are now realizing the sophisticated patterns of proliferation financing networks and are demanding reporting entities to examine the issue of proliferation financing alongside money laundering, terrorist financing, economic sanctions, corruption, etc., because it needs to be categorized separately because it is fraught with so much risk and it has its own nuances and its own patterns, typologies, taxonomies, ontologies, etc. And therefore, regulators are pressuring reporting entities to develop a risk-based approach for proliferation financing and are demanding evidence. Are you training? Are you talking about it? Where's your risk assessment for this? Do you even know what this means? Because in 2025, the national security apparatus for any country has to examine the threat of weapons of mass destruction. And WMD has elements in terms of how it's delivered and how it's impactful in your own territory. But then you have to examine the financial system and the trading environment in your country and your territory that can facilitate the assembly and use of WMD systems abroad. So it's a complex subject, and it needs to have its own um, category.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, unfortunately, there's not much you and I can do with the geopolitical tensions and all the issues going out there. But what we can do is we can educate financial institutions and their staff about various aspects to be on the lookout for. So, let's talk about like blind spots for financial institutions because they all have some. We know that. So, like in your opinion, what are some common blind spots that you see financial institutions facing when it comes to this topic?
So AUSTRAC, the Australian Financial Intelligence Unit, produced a national risk assessment on proliferation financing in Australia back in 2022. And a quote from that report, and it's a very well done piece of work. AUSTRAC is a very well run organization in terms of publishing documents of relevance for financial institutions and otherwise around the world. And the quote is, the consequences of proliferation financing activities are not always readily identifiable or easy to measure. And so it's something where a reporting entity into an FIU, a bank, an
Mm.
MSB, finance company, what have you have to figure out how that organization, that firm, can become involved in a proliferation financing network. And there are things called proliferation pathways.
Mm.
And the pathways are trading patterns or logistics patterns that have very favorable environments for proliferation financing. Um, that's a determination that an organization has to make in terms of their exposure to proliferation pathways.
Mm.
Is our business conducive to facilitating or working inside a proliferation pathway? And then you have to remember that the proliferation networks themselves, this often involves large amounts of money. I mean, you don't exactly go to the dollar store to pick up highly enriched uranium. Um, these things can be very expensive. The components, the delivery systems, the expertise. Uh, costs a lot of money. And so the facilitators, those that create and manage proliferation networks, they're staffed by professionals, whether they're financial services professionals, legal, logistics, navigating bureaucracies within civil service, or enforcement. And when I say enforcement, that means keeping the proliferation network in line, because if somebody steps out of line, you're not going to call the cops on them, are you? And one of the greatest proliferators in fairly recent history was a gentleman named Abdul Qadir Khan,
Mhm.
a gentleman from Pakistan who worked for a Dutch nuclear company and then took his education on the road, went back to Pakistan, helped the Pakistanis build their nuclear weapons program, and also in the process realized there's gold in them Thar hills. And
Mhm.
he became very, very wealthy
Right.
by assisting countries such as North Korea, who was very good at making missiles, but not so good on managing cascades of highly enriched uranium gas. And so he created a proliferation network that was global in scope and involved enormous amounts of money. The consequences of this was that he embarrassed the Pakistanis greatly, and they decided to level the boom on him. And so they put him under house arrest in Pakistan in a gorgeous compound. I know someone who's actually walked past it, and I said, "Take a photo," and he goes, "Yeah, no, I don't think so." And so there he's, you know, winding down his days. But the professionals are something to consider. Um, Other blind spots include offshore financial centers. So proliferation networks can use trade finance to move dual use goods or other components from various jurisdictions. But then you have the relative safety of an offshore financial center with its varying levels of anonymity and beneficial ownership restrictions. And that's where you put in your back-to-back letters of credit
Mhm.
so that the LC is nicely sheltered in an environment of bank secrecy. And there are other jurisdictions that don't really take proliferation financing into a separate category. They say, well, we examine sanctions and we examine export controls and anti-money laundering. So yeah, we'll be okay. And I disagree with that. I think that's uh, the a naive approach.
Right.
Um, and so to prevent these blind spots, when a financial institution conducts its risk assessments, you do have to insert the PF category. There's no other way to do it.
Mm.
You can't do a box ticking approach of, well, how could proliferation financing work with us? We're just a small bank in the middle of nowhere, or we deal in private banking. That's nothing to do with proliferation financing. And both those statements are highly inaccurate.
Mhm.
The private banking one, particularly so, because in many private banking operations, what we've learned, especially from the Epstein case, is that the private bankers run the commercial banking relationships of the high net worth individual
Yeah.
outside of the standard corporate banking environment. So even in private banking, the PF risks are substantial. So those blind spots will become apparent once you conduct that risk assessment and you do it with an open mind, saying, we have to think about this because we can't get this wrong. We just can't.
No, this is not an area where we want to tick the box. I mean,
No.
the repercussions are just beyond extreme. But no, thanks for that. I mean, it's good to know the blind spots that institutions need to be aware of. But, going one level down and talking about red flags, which to me is like the best takeaway for people who attend training to really leverage on the job. they're easy to take away and recall, when the situation does warrant it. So, are there particular red flags or even, say, transaction patterns that compliance teams should be paying more attention to?
Yes, yes. The short answer is yes. The long answer is let's spend the next 3 hours talking about it. Uh, it's not the Wile E. Coyote walking around with an oil drum labeled radioactive, uh, and trying to pass it off as something else. Um, there's export controls circumvention that is an enormous concern. There's trade-based money laundering, which includes deceptive and fraudulent trade documentation to move value around in order to pay for components or entire weapon systems. There's marine sector abuse and deceptive shipping practices. The deceptive shipping practices alone, which I think caught the attention of the FATF in their last plenary,
Mhm.
those are very impressive because the deceptive shipping practices in use today covering enormous an enormous breadth of goods, whether it's oil coming out of Iran going to other areas, but pretending to be from a non-Iranian source, whether it's weapon systems. Didn't Israel send a bunch of commandos on a ship that uncovered a boatload of missiles and guns somewhere in the middle of nowhere, based on intelligence they had gathered? And it's camouflaging the ships by turning off the automatic identification system to disappear at port A and magically reappear at port B. I mean, there are companies today that use satellite imagery, that use triangulation, that use tremendous levels of technology to ensure that banks have access to information that allow them to identify potential deceptive shipping practices. And it's very sophisticated. It's effectively running a National Reconnaissance Office, which is a member of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in the United States. It's a private sector version of an NRO in order for banks to be comfortable with the risks associated of trade finance processing to ensure that the underlying transaction is not facilitating something where deceptive shipping practices are being undertaken, whether it's smuggling oil from a sanctioned country or PF components or WMD components. My apologies. Then there's
Wow.
mislabeled goods within trade finance.
Mhm.
Uh, Something that's labeled cosmetics, glows in the dark, and makes your teeth fall out. Well, maybe that's
Yeah.
something worth examining. There's suspicious use of international business corporations and offshore financial centers. That's typical for anyone who wants to camouflage anything.
Okay.
Um, One of the interesting areas that we've caught on to, courtesy of our partnerships with firms such as Elliptic, the blockchain investigation software firm, and some of our relationships with public sector agencies who are clients and financial institutions too. Some of the bigger financial institutions who've ingested the fact that they run extraordinary PF risks have dedicated professionals, many of whom have backgrounds in military service. And they are incredibly perceptive and cognizant of the fact that crypto assets are now starting to rear their heads
Yeah.
into PF networks. So you have to look at virtual asset service providers and their sanctions circumvention. Um, Virtual currencies and underlying financial technology used to transfer value between locations under the nose of competent authorities. Uh, that's incredibly interesting. I mean, the, one of my favorites was I was at a conference in New York a short while ago, and there was a guy there who was talking about the fact that the Iranians, realizing that selling oil overseas is bloody difficult, thought, well, why don't we just keep the oil, get a whole bunch of generators, and do Bitcoin mining in the middle of the hills?
Yeah.
And Bitcoin can flow out of the country without impediment, relatively speaking. And that's a far better way of making use of the oil we produce rather than try and stuff it into a large ship and send it overseas into different markets. So necessity is the mother of invention, and people
Mm.
uh, pursuing a proliferation financing network are very inventive. Um, so I would couple all those particular red flags, and I know I'm generalizing it to a
Yeah.
tremendous amount, but we don't have the time to delve into the minutia, with a thorough examination of dual use goods. Uh, Dual use goods are goods that have a civilian use and then they have a military use. And my favorite example of that is the Toyota pickup truck, because on the highway that I'll be driving on in a couple of hours, there will be Toyota pickup trucks, and they're fairly innocuous and purring along at a decent speed. But in places like Afghanistan, you can't mount a guerrilla insurgency or an effective military group such as the Taliban without having a whole host of Toyota pickup trucks. So is that a dual use good? Well, there's an argument that says it is. So other dual use goods include ceramic magnets, which at first glance seem preposterous as a
Mm.
component of a nuclear weapon systems or biological weapons. And in fact, they're used on spindles for centrifuges that are built in large arrays for highly enriched uranium gas, to the point where these arrays take highly enriched uranium gas from one level of concentration through a series of centrifuges, and at the end of it, out pops weapons grade uranium. And the magnets that allow these centrifuges to spin at incredible speed are ceramic magnets. And so without a ceramic magnet, your entire highly enriched uranium array becomes useless. So these little magnets are very heavily regulated, and rightly so. CNC milling machines, way, way back, had massive restrictions on them in Europe and the United States. I remember in the 80s reading about this, and it was because once you get a CNC milling machine of a certain caliber, you can begin to mill propellers for submarines that have undulations on them that provide sonic camouflage. So these types of propellers emit far less noise than a standard propeller put onto a submarine, because it reduces the amount of cavitation, which is the bubbles forming off the surface of the propeller from friction with the water. And so the CNC milling machine became a very heavily regulated good and subject to very stringent export controls. So it's when you peer at the science behind these types of weapon systems, you can begin to appreciate that certain goods, while they may have a particular civilian use, like any milling machine would, they can also have terrifying dual uses with weapons of mass destruction.
Every time we talk, I always learn something, and I also learn that I stay up later at night thinking about it. So I do appreciate that.
Well,
You
on it,
know?
no, it's serious, Justin. Seriously, this is one of the
Yeah,
problems of this type of subject. Like
yeah,
we've we've poured our we published FIU Connect Proliferation Financing. I don't know, was it 5 years ago?
right.
The first version, and we had originally wanted to publish it in 2014, and nobody was going to buy it because our
Mm,
clients are like, that's not a big issue. And
right.
now everyone's clamoring for it. And when you dive into the research and when you dive into the process of assembling a training program that's useful for a bank and useful for civil service, you have
Mhm.
to go through tremendous amounts of information, none of which is any pleasant um, material to read about, and it's all death and destruction.
Yeah.
And the ones that haunt me are the older ones. Like the first time human beings used biological weapons was, and this is just this is going to keep you up at night, Justin, and I'm going to apologize now.
Thank you.
But it was the siege of Constantinople where where the people laying the siege of Constantinople put plague-ridden bodies on catapults and flung them into Constantinople behind the walls. And these bodies, which were infested with the fleas that cause bubonic plague, would land amongst the civilian population and get everyone sick. Like that's pretty twisted.
To say the
A-
least. Yeah.
and then there's the Bashar al-Assad,
Mm.
who must win an award for being one of the most evil people ever to walk the face of the planet. Uh, he would, in various parts of Syria, Raqqa, etc., he would send a helicopter out that would uh, release a barrel bomb on a parachute, and the bomb would blow down to the ground and then detonate. And it was filled with high explosive. But people would see it and know, and they would run into bomb shelters and await the detonation, and then hopefully survive the experience. But because they were in the low-level bomb shelters, that was an opportune moment to send another aircraft and drop chlorine gas. And chlorine gas is heavier than standard air.
Mhm.
And so it would land on the surface, but then the gas, being heavier than air, would go down the staircase and down into the bomb shelters where everyone had gathered because of the barrel bomb, and kill everyone, men, women, and children. It didn't matter. And that's a particular type of evil that thankfully, you don't see very often. And that was Bashar al-Assad
Wow.
using chemical weapons.
Yes.
I hope there's a special place in hell for that man.
I mean, I agree with you, and I hope so as well. But now, one quick question for you, though, based on all of this, is this type of information that's in your new proliferation financing module? Because it's coming out at the end of the month, right?
It is, it is. We've
Oh,
we've
cool.
finished it, and one of the challenges of creating a training program on PF is finding credible sources who want to talk publicly.
That's true.
So we've gone to individuals who are employed within the intelligence community or who have retired from the intelligence community, and they're very happy to talk to us because it allows them to shape the conversation so that financial institutions will understand the risks and report what the IC needs to know in order to combat these PF networks. It's a battle between the IC and the proliferators and their uh, financiers, logistics personnel, bureaucrats, etc. And they can be state actors or non-state actors. And so getting these people to work with us on this subject is very difficult.
Yeah.
And we have some, and they're quoted at the beginning of the digital textbook. So there's two of them right now that are going through the final draft. And we hope to have their approval within the next week or so. Because the subject is too important
Yeah.
to just get it slightly right. Uh, those that have credentials in this area have to give us the green light. Some of our competitors in the training space publish their courses with spelling mistakes and
Mm.
pretty shabby content that was very poorly researched. We don't do that.
Right.
It's too important. So we're in the final stages, and once we get their sign off, then we'll publish to our clients globally, and it'll pop up in their FIU Connect digital classrooms at the drop of a hat.
Oh, that's great. Now we'll definitely be following your progress. But Kim, as always, we always have these fascinating conversations. And with proliferation financing, yeah, it's definitely top of mind. And it isn't always top of mind for financial institutions either. But as you've discussed in pretty good detail, this is an issue that touches risk, compliance, and even global security. And, the work you and your team are doing with FIU Connect, it really does help break down and make it a lot simpler to digest and understand and, provide that actionable, resources for institutions around the world. So, a huge thank you to you for joining us today for our very first episode of HRE Insights in 30. And this is just the beginning. We'll be bringing you more conversations like this with leaders and innovators across the risk and compliance space going forward. And also, be sure to catch our next episode where we'll be joined by Judy Gaishi, CEO and co-founder of the Third Party Risk Association. And we'll be talking all things third-party risk management and why it matters more than ever in today's financial world. So thanks for tuning in. And Kim, thank you so much for the time today. I really enjoyed it. Now,
Justin, it's my pleasure, and I gotta say, you do great work, and we're Manchester CF is always proud to back your efforts. Keep up the good work, my friend.
absolutely. I appreciate it, Kim. And thank you again.